Well, hello. My name is Kate Bracken. I am with the Master Gardener Association in Goochland, Powhatan, and I am glad to be here and for the soil because without our healthy soil, we don't have life.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee, and this week we're going to go straight to part one of a conversation between a very special guest, Carl Stafford, along with Dr. Eric Bendfeldt, Virginia Cooperative Extension Community Viability, and Mary Sketch Bryant, Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Let's go right to it.
Well, thank you, Jeff. It's a real pleasure this morning to have an extension colleague with us, Carl Stafford. Carl's a longtime extension agent for agriculture and natural resources in Culpeper County. He's done a lot of work in the Piedmont region as well as across the state related to forages and soil health, and also has been recognized by the American Forage and Grassland Council for his contribution in grassland agriculture. So we're very pleased to have Carl with us. And Carl, if you'd like to give us a little bit more background about yourself and your interest in soil health, that'd be great.
So the grazing part of agriculture involves livestock that consume their diet, and that cow in the background is where I learned what grazing was. And you might imagine Jerry Swisher being part of that conversation. Fairly energetic and enthusiastic. So I learned about grazing through Jerry Swisher and dairy cows. So it matters when you change their diet. You see it immediately in the milk tank. And so you get this feedback to whether you're doing a good job or not. And that set me on a path to understanding how to manage grass to benefit grazing livestock. And in that grass management, we get a benefit we can't see, and that's what's under the ground and in the soil. And you know, that soil life component can support our grazing livestock and our forage production, and we can do things that deliberately benefit it. And resting pastures, it promotes grass growth, and I'm sure there's microbial growth going on under the ground. We can measure it directly with organic matter tests, but gotten to be quite a fan of the soil health, soil life component, the moisture holding capacity, the nutrient release. It's something we don't see and need to understand better, and I'm trying to do that.
Oh, thank you,
Carl. You I know we hear a lot. I think one line is, it's not the cow, it's the how. So I'd just love to hear a little bit about how you see both, through your work in Culpeper, that well-managed grazing lands is really critical to soil health.
Yeah, so I learned, so soil health is a topic that's been used by a lot of people that pay attention to soil and that pay attention to that connection between plants and animals and soil. But I really got dialed in through Alan Franz Luber's and his soil test biological activity, which has its own controversy around it. But his understanding of that and appreciation for the life and the productivity and the storage and release of nutrients as the decay of organic matter occurs naturally, and what can that do for a system that we've traditionally supplemented with applied nutrients, be it chemical fertilizer or livestock manures. We have been conscious of adding nutrients to systems to get more production, higher quality production. And so still learning more about it, but realizing that the benefit and the improvement that can occur. So just one illustration would be if you graze a plant off pretty short, you also prune its roots. And in pruning roots, you change the ability of the plant to grow and to produce, and soil life begins to change. So the roots are a big part of what's in the ground and decomposing in the ground besides litter on top of the ground. So I think I'm all around your question. I'm not sure I've directly answered it. I could take another stab at it.
No, that's perfect. I mean, the soil life part is so huge in a lot of what we talk about with For the Soil and in the coalition.
And then, Carl, I think through the years, it seems like there's been an emphasis on both the chemical and physical properties, but now I think there's more interest in the biological properties and particularly the carbon cycle and how that influences nutrient availability, but then so many other physical and chemical properties, as well as providing sort of infrastructure for soil microbes. So I think your interest is really right on.
And in parallel with that is a huge enthusiasm for no-till cropping. And I learned about no-till from a farmer, some training and other things, but I really got it when I was on the farm and this guy was not working the land. And in fact, was crestfallen when Jimmy Bowen, who managed Beauregard Farm at Brandy Station, he let the sludge company work his land. And I'm like, Jimmy, why'd you let him do? Well, didn't cost anything. And they thought it was important. And well, no, actually they were just trying to not alert the neighbors of the smell of sludge is what they were doing. But anyhow, you can see the soil quality. You can just see it. You can drag your toe through a no-till soil and it just has texture and is soft and so no-till, we might use chemicals to do it, but we're building organic matter, we're improving soil health. It's the way to go, and it keeps soil in place, and no-till is the only way to grow crops, in my opinion.
Carl, so speaking some of, we've talked about forage production and then crop production. Are you seeing much? I'm hearing of some more innovation around integrating livestock with crop production. Are you seeing much of that happening in your region?
We've decoupled those two systems, and because that's the thing to do. And we don't have time for livestock on a big crop farm, but yet that example I just gave, the cattle use land that's not well suited for crops, and they consume and utilize forage resources that may not be premium. So the cows end up being a complement to the crop system, and then the nutrients, their manures, can be put back on the land, and they can utilize the crop residue. I ask people repeatedly, you ever graze corn stalks after harvest? I've measured corn yields a lot, and when I'm walking those fields, I go, wow, what a resource. This is good. This is feed for cow herds, maybe not young growing cattle, but it'll certainly maintain a mama cow. So we've gotten away from that. And big farmers don't have time to fool with cows and fences and water, and they'd rather be fixing equipment in the shed in the winter rather than feeding cattle. But so maybe there can be incentives that get them to do it. Maybe people see a benefit. I don't know. So we've decoupled those two systems, and we need to make links back.
And Carl, is thinking about the integration of livestock. You've mentioned you work with dairy cattle and beef cattle, and but then also I think there's, as people try to diversify, integration of sheep or goats or even layer hens and such. What are you seeing as far as the integration and diversification in your area of Culpeper?
I don't see much of that. I appreciate in small examples where you'll see multiple species, but at scale, I put it this way, cattle are a lot easier than sheep. Small ruminants require very high management ability. They require a shepherd, and shepherds, at least in one view, are born. I said that at a funeral for a shepherd, and that Joe Apperson was born a shepherd, and he had a grandson that was also a shepherd. And they're unique people. They pay attention to the details, and they keep these little critters alive when they're birthing babies and being preyed upon by dogs and coyotes, and when there's parasites, and we can. So there's a lot of management required in small ruminants, and I think the average cattle producer may not have that ability or the interest. So part of the shepherd ability is having the interest, and it's kind of like women are better at rearing calves because they're more attentive to signs. The shepherd is that way. So I think it'd be the minority that do that, but it's a great combination. I see some sheep running with cows on a nearby farm in Madison County, and the reason those sheep are there is because of the wife, and so she has a family history of sheep, and so she's made sure there's sheep in this operation for the children and for the complement to the cow herd. She actually happens to be a spinagle from over in the Highland County area. So sheep and spinaggles go together. I don't mean to tell people's names, but I'm pretty sure she's the reason those sheep are there.
And Carl, I know that you're very interested in I know it's a broad term, but innovation. How do we help producers innovate, whether through equipment or approaches to increase their farm profitability and as well as their soil health? Would love to hear any examples of what you've been working on recently with producers.
I think innovation often comes from them seeing others' examples, and we study farmers' behavior when we found that they're very interested in their peers' efforts and in examples that look like them, and the looking like them matters today. So we need to have some representatives of all the different farmers we've got. I take children through a cattle barn at our show, and I find young women who are farmers and look, there's a farmer. And I find other people that don't look like me and point out to them that here's examples of people who look like the children that are looking at them. The point being with examples is that people look to their peers to follow. There's some leaders, there's some followers, and there's some late adopters. And that group in the middle is looking for examples. And the early adopters are those examples. We go and visit, we talk about and show, and then we stand back and let those producers interact and solve common problems.
And Carl, you have on your shirt there the Graze 300. If you could tell us about that initiative, and I think really trying to extend the grazing system and season for people, if you could elaborate on that.
So that program started March 2005, and the intent was to take farmers to cow herds that were still grazing in early March, and it worked. We gave them a cheap sandwich and some fencing materials. Most of the money was spent on fencing materials, and we put our boots on the ground on a cow herd nearby. That here's some cows that are still grazing, and they look pretty good. The producer that was doing it explained why he was doing it. They nodded their heads, and I don't know that there was a sea change after that. In fact, I thought when grain prices went up, maybe people would be more concerned about their cost. Graze 300 is the basis of making money. It's about doing something that's more profitable than the traditional. So traditional would be feeding hay from Thanksgiving to Easter. It's a long winter. It's what we know. It's what we're good at, but it's gotten very, very expensive. It's about twice the cost of a day of grazing, and performance is essentially the same. In fact, in cases, a grazing system could be even better. But in general, they're about equal, and cost is about half if you're grazing. Now, you can graze every day of the year and be profitable per cow, but there aren't enough cows for total profit to be higher. So if you feed some hay and run more cows, the total profit is more for the system, less per individual, but there's more units, so total profit is higher. And the Thanksgiving to Easter example has the highest gross, but ends up being a break even or a loss.
So the aim would be to graze for at least 300 days out of the year. And
it could be 300 is a nice round number. And it was picked because it was easy to remember. It was a nice round number. It wasn't because it was a magic number of days. It turns out, by backing into it, that the economics support some hay feeding, but a longer grazing season. So what works for the individual is what I'd recommend. And if they can make and feed hay at 50 cents a day, they ought to do it, because grazing is about 50 cents a day. Hay feeding is $1 or better a day. And those are round numbers. They're not exact for everybody, but that's kind of the comparison.
And Carl, does Virginia lend itself particularly well to that program because of its weather?
It does. So an old agronomist, a grazing livestock agronomist in Missouri, and I'll get his name if we go a little further. So he looked at from Mississippi to Illinois, up and down the Mississippi River Valley. He said the hay feeding days are about the same from the bottom to the top, and it puzzles you why the folks in the south part of that watershed would not have more days of grazing. So there's something traditional going on. I don't know. So Virginia is well suited. We've got a nice long growing season, mild winters generally. Virginia is well suited for this.
Interesting. That surprises me around the Mississippi to Illinois, but very neat.
They're all feeding about the same number of days. Jim Garish did this. Jim Garish, he's in Idaho right now, grazing irrigated land, still talks and writes extensively, but he shook his head. Why? It should be an increasing number of hay feeding days as you go up the Mississippi Valley, but it was all about the same.
I know we're just about at time here. It's gone so fast, but Eric, do you have one more question?
You've mentioned different people, last Jim Garish, and I worked closely with Jerry Swisher, who was a dairy science agent based in Augusta County, but worked across the state. Would there be other key people or resources that you would recommend, Carl?
Arlen White came to Culpeper to help lay out a grazing system. I didn't have any idea what it looked like then, and he stood there in the field with the producer that ended up grazing beef cattle, but moved to dairy. And dairy is a big deal. If you can get milk out of cows grazing, you are good. It's almost like being a shepherd. So this guy, Rob Price, set it up, learned his craft, applied it then later to dairy cows, and ended up doing so well at it that he was able to rent that system out to a farmer who's now gone out of business with milk price. But he created a system that worked, and it was moving cows, and quality was put in front of them sometimes twice a day. And so that supported performance. And Arlen White was part of that, and Vivian Allen and Scott Carr and Dale Wolf. So I've named off a pedigree of people that were at Virginia Tech when I started. They were all part of me learning this grazing. So the word grazing is used in Swisher's world with intent. So I'm grazing. So to graze is not the same as grazing with intent. So I can tell when I hear his voice that there's an intent. Are you grazing? I'm grazing. That means something, and it's not just being on pasture. Getting results, getting performance, having good looking grass and soil that's being held in place and improved over time. So they're very important people. And Ozzie Abai, she too, a great scientist.
Well, thank you, Carl. We've really enjoyed this episode with Carl Stafford, Extension Agent, Agriculture and Natural Resources, based in Culpeper County, Virginia, and integral to Graze 300. Thank you so much, Carl, for being with us today.
My pleasure. Bobby Clark in Shenandoah deserve some credit for this program having the profile that it does. And I've had some of the know-how, and he's had some of the he's had the other part that's complementary.
And that concludes part one of the conversation with Carl Stafford with Virginia Cooperative Extension. Also, Dr. Eric Bendfeldt, Virginia Cooperative Extension Community Viability, and Mary Sketch Bryant, Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Hope you'll tune in for part two coming up in just a couple of weeks. For the Soil, a conversation is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, just visit the website forthesoil.org. If you should have a specific question about soil health, call your local extension office, contact your local USDA Service Center, or perhaps the Soil and Water Conservation District office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of the Flip Charts, all rights reserved. For the Soil, a conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee.